Okay, so a few things come into play when you're thinking about cinematic video. So when you say you're going to be creating a cinematic video, we're probably talking about making your video or your picture look like film or mimicking. I would say that when starting out to create either video or, learning photography, the most important thing that you have to learn in the beginning is how aperture, ISO, and shutter speed work together. Aperture is something that is related to your camera lens. Now, each camera lens opens up to let in light, and that is the aperture rings opening and closing up. So an aperture of 1.8 is much larger opening than f3.5, for example. So a larger aperture is usually much better for when you want a blurry background. It's an effect that the lens creates when the aperture is opened up wide enough. And obviously focal length and aperture also work hand in hand, especially when it comes to zoom lenses, because when you basically change your focal length, for example, to 50 millimeter on a 16 to 50 millimeter kit lens, for example, you are only going to be able to have a large aperture of about, say, f5, I think. So you won't be able to open up your lens to its widest aperture because that is the way that the lens has been created. Next thing is shutter speed. Now, shutter speed is obviously when your camera shutter is opening up and letting it once again light to create a picture. So your shutter speed is usually dependent on your frame rate, and that is the 180-degree rule, where your shutter speed is supposed to be double your frame rate to get some really good motion blur. So if your shutter speed is way faster or not at the right rate or matching your frame rate, the motion blur is going to be, your camera will be capturing different from what the eye is used to seeing it. So the 180-degree rule actually helps us to create video that looks natural to our eye. Now, the third thing that you have to take into consideration is ISO. And it's always mentioned that it is good to shoot at your camera's native ISO. Of my camera specifically, the Sony a6400's native ISO is from 100 to 32,000. It is extremely important to make sure that your ISO is not too high or too low, because all three things affect your video, your picture basically, and you should balance all of them out. So obviously, when learning how to set your ISO, you can start out with doing an automatic ISO, which I would recommend if you're starting out. I would recommend learning how to use your camera manually, because if you do not learn how to do that, you'll never understand how these three things work together. So balancing these three things, you can basically get the exact look that you're going for. And that is why I recommend actually learning how to use your camera and how to use aperture, ISO, and of course, one of the most important things, shutter speed. Now, going back to the 180-degree rule of the shutter speed, FPS, meaning frames per second, would normally be 24, depending on whether you're using PAL or NTC. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, you obviously have to change your shutter speed to 1/50th of a second. And if you're shooting at 30 frames per second, which I know usually varies from which country you're in, if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. If you're shooting at 30 frames per second, you're gonna have to change your shutter speed to 1/60th of a second, because that is double your frame rate. So with regards to log profiles, I would say Okay, this is just me saying, but I think this is probably how we look at it. Unlocking maximum dynamic range, because it really, really does help you to change the way that your videos look. So if you have a specific look you're going for example, placing things intentionally inside your frame, you can manipulate the colors of those specific items within your frame. For example, practical lights within your frame. You can change the color of these lights by changing the hues and playing with your lights. And also, when shooting with a burnt-in profile, for example, you're not using S-Log profiles on your Sony camera, you will get a good-looking shot, but you won't be able to manipulate the shot to the extent that you would be able to manipulate it if you were shooting in S-Log 3 or 2 or HLG, all these picture profiles that Sony has available. Also, the dynamic range will not be the same either, because obviously you're shooting with a saturated, already burnt in, saturated and contrasty look, where when you're shooting in an S-Log profile or HLG, you have a very desaturated and not contrasty at all. Saturation and contrast is removed completely in S-Log, and then you're able to put it back in post, basically transferring your image from the S-Log profile to Rec 709, and then after that you can go nuts with your color grading and you can enjoy that. Now obviously, if you are not comfortable shooting in S-Log 3 or S-Log 2 and you really just want to run and gun, come back and then just do some minor changes on your videos, that's really okay. And you can obviously just change your picture profile to Sony 2 or HLG. Now obviously, I know we all love shooting in 4K. And yes, 4K is absolutely beautiful. So when shooting on your Sony A6400 or your Sony camera per se, what I would recommend is shooting in 4K, especially if your camera has the capabilities, do so. Now, if you do have a Sony A6400 or a lower model like myself, then obviously you can't shoot slow motion in 4K. You will have to change your camera settings to 1080p when you are trying to do slow motion shots. Now, how slow motion works is you basically have to shoot at 1080p at 60 frames per second. And once you transfer your files, you're basically going to place them in your editing software on a 30 frames per second timeline. And this will automatically slow down your video. Now, obviously, there are other ways to basically, hack this, but today we're only talking about basic stuff and how to do basic settings on your Sony camera in order to achieve cinematic results. Now, you would obviously couple your camera with something cool like a black promise filter to create the beautiful halation on lights within the frame, to create some halation on practical lights in the back. And this actually really does make a difference with regards to the halation and actually softening up your image to look beautiful like it should in a film, which is also very, very close to how the eye sees lights and, of course, everything else within your real world. Now, another thing that is really important when it comes to creating cinematic videos will be to use an ND filter, which is also something that I do not have right now, but I am waiting for mine. And as soon as it's here, I will make a video about it and a demonstration on how I use it. Now, with an ND filter is literally like sunglasses for your camera. Now, obviously, if you know that you're going out to shoot outside, and obviously you have absolutely no control over the sunlight because the sunlight is quite sharp, especially when you're going out during the day, midday, and it's not golden hour or blue hour yet, because we all know we like to shoot at blue hour or golden hour. But if it's not that time of the day yet, you are going to have problems with your shutter speed, the 180-degree rule. You won't be able to follow that rule because you're obviously gonna have to turn down your shutter speed. And obviously we don't want to close up our aperture because we want that beautiful blurry background of the videos that we are creating to create that filmic look, right? So guys, with all of that being said, all I'm going to leave you guys with is that, you know what, be creative, and yes, learn the basic rules of creating beautiful video. I'll see you in the next video, and I hope that this video was very valuable to someone, and if it was, please subscribe to this channel and please like this video, and I will see you in the next one. Ciao.